Towards the end of his fifth regnal year, around June of 1287 BCE, the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II decided to launch an attack on the city of Kadesh. This was a fortified town in what is now Syria, and it occupied a space roughly halfway between the Hittite Empire in Anatolia and the Egyptian kingdom in the Nile Valley. Kadesh had been a perennial thorn in the side of the New Kingdom pharaohs. Dating all the way back to Thutmose III, rulers of Kadesh had orchestrated rebellions and wars against the Egyptian army. Now it was Ramesses' turn to face this troublesome city. But why? What was so important about Kadesh? Why would Ramesses launch himself hundreds of miles from home in order to take a distant, troublesome town? This question, and others related to it, are ones that my guest today has spent a great deal of time researching and considering. Please welcome back to the show Professor Peter Brand. Peter Brand is professor at the University of Memphis in the United States. He leads an archaeological project at Karnak Temple, surveying and documenting the great hypostyle hall erected by King Seti I and decorated by Seti and his son Ramesses. Peter has joined us several times on the podcast to discuss the reigns and deeds of these rulers, which he lays out in his recent book, Ramesses II, Egypt's Ultimate Pharaoh. As this podcast prepares to tell the story of the Battle for Kadesh and the fallout of that magnificent campaign, Professor Brand steps in to give us some essential context and to understand why this city in particular was so important both to Egypt and the Hittites. Please welcome back Professor Peter Brand. Hello, Professor Brand. Peter, welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be back. Looking forward to it.
How are you doing on this Memorial Day weekend as we're recording?
Well, it's a bit dreary here. We've had some rain, but after just getting back from Egypt, where I had my fill of sun and hot weather, it's actually not too bad.
You were working at Karnak on the hypostyle hall, is that correct?
Yes, that's right. So we were recording the battle scenes of You Know Who, and so we've been working on this for the past 2 years, sort of checking and making adjustments to some drawings based on what work we had done back in the 1990s to record these rather battered battle scenes that show the later wars of Ramesses II that he fought after the Battle of Kadesh.
Sure. And hopefully in the future we'll get a chance to talk about those. But just very briefly, how is the hypostyle project going in your perspective? Are you satisfied with progress? Where do you think it's at?
Well, these things always take longer than you expect, and it's really a project of a lifetime and perhaps several lifetimes. I expect that basically it's a life sentence, as it were, although there's no place I'd rather be. There's no other place I've actually worked in Egypt. I would like to do some epigraphy work in other locations, but my heart and my body are, as it were, chained to the hypostyle hall, and I'm perfectly content to work there. So it is obviously a long-term project. There's so much to do. It's a giant building that's completely covered with inscriptions, even the roof. So there's a lot to do.
Out of curiosity, if you had the chance to do epigraphy on any monument in Egypt that wasn't the hypostyle hall, past or present, where might you have chosen?
Well, I'm interested in Ramesses' battle scenes, and one of the places I'd like to work is actually on the facade of a nearby Luxor temple, where the best preserved, perhaps, of the renditions of the Battle of Kadesh are located on the giant facade of the pylon at Luxor Temple, and these have never been properly recorded. They're actually among the earliest things that were ever recorded in the great publications of people like Champollion and Rossellini. But to do them on a scientific basis would be wonderful, and nobody's really gotten around to doing that. And so that would probably be my number one choice.
Is anybody working on the military reliefs at the moment, or is that a long-term down the road kind of thing as far as you know?
Yeah, nobody has really done anything recently. Um, so I have no idea when anybody's going to get around to it. As it were, dead in the water right now.
That's a shame, but hopefully in the future. So, if you're ready, I'd like to start talking about the strategic context of Kadesh, because we can't understand the battle without understanding where Ramesses and the Egyptian kingdom is prior to it, and generally, why does the battle take place here? Why is this important? By the time that Ramesses comes to power, let's say the 50 years preceding his accession, how is the Egyptian empire actually faring in Syria and Canaan in the Near East? How are they doing? Are they on a high or are they on a low?
Well, this is one of the issues that we have to think about is that in early scholarship on ancient Egypt, especially after the discovery of this collection of diplomatic letters known as the Amarna letters, these cuneiform texts that were found in the ruins of Akhenaten's capital, Akhetaten, also known as El Amarna. When you read these letters, the bulk of which are from various vassal states, these petty Canaanite and Syrian kingdoms that owed their allegiance to Pharaoh and were part of the Egyptian empire, they report all kinds of chaotic conditions in the pharaoh's bailiwick. In Canaan, they described how their neighbors were always fighting with them. They plead for assistance. They denounce their neighbors for perfidy of trying to attack them and even threatening the interests of Pharaoh himself through their duplicity and disloyalty. Whereas the upper part of the empire in the north, in Syria, not only do they report these kind of internecine battles, but they're a very real threat from another empire, the resurgent Hittite Empire, under its great warlord king Suppiluliuma, with the long unpronounceable name, was on the march and upsetting the apple cart, as it were. Whereas for a couple of generations, Egypt and its former rival, the Empire of Mitanni, seemed to have reached some kind of accommodation to be at peace and perhaps divide up Syria amongst themselves. Now, the Hittites had become resurgent and were bent on reconquest of much of Syria at the expense of Mitanni, and perhaps also at the expense of Egypt itself. And so various Syrian vassals of Egypt are reporting that the Hittites are on the march, and they claim that an important supposed vassal of Egypt, the kingdom of Amurru, is in league with the Hittites, and it's supposed to be loyal to Egypt, but is now a turncoat and even assisting the Hittites in conquering supposed Egyptian vassals, including the kingdom of Kadesh. And there's this description in the Hittite archives of how Adikama, the king of Kadesh, that he put up resistance to the Hittite king when supposedly Suppiluliuma was only trying to march by the territory of Kadesh, and that the king of Kadesh had tried to fight him, and therefore Suppiluliuma attacked Kadesh and took it from the kingdom of Egypt and added it to his own empire. So there's a lot of dust and confusion and fighting going on in Syria, and Egypt seems to be the loser, and the Hittites seem to be the winner. And when all this dust settles, the Hittites pretty much seem to control all of Syria, as far south as the northern borders of Lebanon and what is today known as the Bekaa Valley, including the border kingdoms of Amurru and Kadesh. And this doesn't sit lightly with the Egyptians. And it begins what amounts to a kind of 65-year period of intermittent hostilities beginning under Akhenaten and culminating with the famous peace treaty of Ramesses II in his 21st regnal year, when he finally buries the hatchet with the Hittites and puts an end to this multi-generational conflict between these two empires, essentially over who gets to control Syria.
And you'd referenced this sort of in the beginning, especially in previous decades, say up to maybe the 1970s or 80s. There was a persistent perception, the crumbling of the borderlands, Amurru and Kadesh, away from Egyptian control, was something of the fault of Akhenaten as some kind of pacifist king more interested in his sun worship. What is your understanding of the conflict in that first phase?
Well, it's even more than that in terms of the way earlier Egyptologists had condemned Akhenaten's supposed negligence of the empire. For instance, if you look at the work of James Henry Breasted, the pioneering American Egyptologist written about a little more than 100 years ago, he would blame Akhenaten for actually allowing the whole Canaanite and Syrian empire from sliding down the tubes. When you look at the Canaanite letters, when these various petty kings are squabbling with one another, he claimed that the whole of the Levant, the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, was lost to the Egyptians because of this chaos there, and that Akhenaten didn't do a damn thing about it. And so they were all up in arms against each other, fighting with each other, and Akhenaten was sitting in his new religious capital of El Amarna, worshiping the sun and studiously ignoring his duties as an imperial overlord. As in letter after letter, these Canaanite kings would plead for his assistance, and he seemed to be ignoring them. This was especially true of a guy named Ribadi, the king of Byblos, who was constantly writing to the pharaoh. And about the only response that the pharaoh would make is finally he wrote this annoyed letter where he said, "You write to me more than any other king. Please stop." And otherwise, he seemed to be ignoring these kings. And this was interpreted as that he really didn't care. He just wanted to be left alone to worship the Aten, even as the empire supposedly crumbled around him. And as you say, in the 1970s especially, scholars began to take a different view of this. First of all, in the south, it seems that the pharaoh practiced a kind of divide and conquer strategy of allowing these kingdoms to fight amongst themselves as long as the winners paid allegiance to Egypt, and that in the end they were only weakening themselves. They were not rescuing themselves from being under the thumb of Pharaoh. And that really the Canaanite and Lebanese parts of Egyptian hegemony in the south of the Levant were really quite secure. That they only weakened themselves by any fighting, and therefore Egypt's interests there were never really actually threatened. Now, up in the north, in the Syrian borderlands, with the actions of the Hittite Empire, there's no question this threatened Egypt's empire or Egypt's interest there. Whether or not Egypt actually had an empire, whether it had any firm control, even whether anybody had any firm control in terms of these external empires like the Egyptians, the Hittites, or the Mitannis, is now increasingly open to question. Some recent scholarship has questioned the whole idea of an Egyptian empire in Syria. And also, one Egyptologist has now compared places like Amurru, this as a kind of Wild West that was more akin to a kind of ancient Afghanistan, almost like a graveyard of empires where kingdoms like Egypt or the Hittites kind of banged their head against the walls, or where the local overlord would say, "Oh, yes, I'm loyal to you," and then 5 minutes later he says, "Oh, I'm loyal to another guy." Be that as it may, Egypt claimed that the kingdoms of Kadesh and Amuru were loyal to it, but how loyal they really were is really open to question. And of course, we also have reports from the Hittites that claimed that they had taken control of these kingdoms away from Egypt, or that these kingdoms were loyal to them, etc. And so the picture is a lot more murky than we perhaps have been led to believe. But there's no question that the Egyptians thought that Amru and Kadesh belonged to them. And when the Hittites sort of moved into these territories, it upset Egypt's interests. And far from sort of taking it lying down or neglecting his interests there, the pharaoh Akhenaten actually tried to do something about it. The evidence is rather fragmentary, but even in the Amarna letters, there are hints in the form of some of the letters that suggest that the pharaoh was preparing some kind of military response, because some of the letters seem to order various vassals to prepare for an invasion of where the pharaoh is going to lead troops to the north. Now, another case we have that shows that at least during the period, sometime between Akhenaten and the early Ramesside period, that another vassal state of the Hittites, and that formerly was at least nominally loyal to Egypt, a coastal kingdom called Amuru in the very northern coast of the Levant in Syria, the king of Ugarit, this northern Levantine kingdom, a general writes to the king of Ugarit, and he says that in the cold, rainy days of winter, that there are rumors that the Egyptian king is on the march, but nobody knows when he's coming. And the general complains that his own horses and troops are nowhere ready to respond if the Egyptian king shows up. But it seems quite likely that the Egyptian king is on the march. Now, nobody is sure exactly when this letter was written. Some say that this is from the time of Akhenaten or one of the post-Amarna pharaohs. More recently, it's been claimed that this was written in response to one of the campaigns of Hatti I. Others suggest that this was, a response to one of Ramesses II's campaigns, maybe either just before or sometime after the Battle of Kadesh. We don't know, but it shows that even after the loss of the Syrian territories in the time of Akhenaten, the Egyptians had far from given up on their Syrian empire, and even as early as the reign of Akhenaten. Another indication that, in particular, as far as Kadesh goes, that the Egyptians didn't accept the loss of Kadesh is when a pharaoh known as Nip-Kururia in the Hittite records dies. It records how the Egyptians had attacked a place that the Hittites called Kinza, which is their version of the name for Kadesh. And the text implies that the Egyptians had attacked this city twice, not just once. And although it's very hotly debated in both in Egyptology and cuneiform studies who Nip-Kururia actually is, I'm of the camp that believe that he is Tutankhamun. If he is Tutankhamun, then we have two Egyptian attacks on Kadesh, one in the reign of Akhenaten and one in the reign of Tutankhamun. But if he is Akhenaten, as many Egyptologists believe, then presumably Akhenaten made two attacks on Kadesh. But either way, it shows that before Ramesses and Seti, the Egyptians made multiple attacks on Kadesh. So the picture is that south of the Syrian border, far from being chaotic and a total loss as a result of the Amarna period, that really Egypt's territories were quite secure. And as an Italian scholar named Liberani has argued, that far from neglecting affairs, that the Egyptians practice a kind of divide and conquer strategy. And this infighting among the vassals, far from showing that the Egyptians had lost control of their territory, he actually suggests that this amounts to what he calls a policy of permanent abnormality, that the pharaoh is deliberately allowing the vassals to squabble amongst themselves, and he's also deliberately refusing to get involved in this, partly because he sees it as beneath him, but partly because he's, again, this divide and conquer, let them fight amongst themselves. That'll weaken them, and as long as they acknowledge my overlordship, then so much the better. The real problem again was north, the Lebanese border, where southern Syria had essentially fallen to the Hittites, and the Egyptians were eager to get this back.
We're going to take a quick break now for that pesky advertising, and then Professor Brand will return to explore the battles for Kadesh under Horemheb, Seti I, and why Ramesses felt the need to go back. I'll see you soon. So that brings the question naturally around to Kadesh. We seem to have a fair bit of information about Amaru and the problems that their rulers, like Abdiashirta or Aziru, were able to cause. But by comparison, at least in the surviving Egyptian record, we don't seem to hear as much about Kadesh or Kinza. Broadly speaking, why is Kadesh so important that the Egyptians and the Hittites are perennially squabbling over it? What is so significant about this city or kingdom?
Well, I think there are two ways of looking at Egypt's interest in Kadesh. On the one hand, it's the strategic, practical interest that they have there. It is located at a central communication node and pathway. If you come north through the Bekaa Valley between the Lebanese and anti-Lebanon mountains, it's part of a kind of natural inland corridor that leads from central Canaan through Lebanon into the central Syrian plain. So it's an important land corridor. It is situated in the heart of Syria, this borderland that so many empires have used as their plaything and battleground. And so its strategic situation is absolutely crucial in terms of, if you will, its geostrategic importance. And so as a place that you would want to control from that kind of perspective, it is a natural control point and transportation or hub in terms of its position in its physical position in Syria. And of course, it's also one of the larger city-states in the region. So there are a lot of practical reasons that controlling Kadesh is desirable or important from what you might call a geostrategic perspective. But I also think almost psychologically or ideologically that as I would flippantly say that the Egyptians had a bee in their bonnet about Kadesh, going back, I think, to Thutmose III's famous Megiddo campaign, because, of course, the target of the campaign against from that 21st year of Thutmose's the third, his first great campaign of victory, was the city of Megiddo. And his enemy was essentially this giant coalition of Syro-Canaanite city-states and their leaders that had banded together with all their armies to oppose Egypt's interests in the Levant, and they had gathered at Megiddo. But as the texts of the Battle of Megiddo make very clear, the enemy that is singled out as being responsible for this is the wretched Great One of Kadesh. So Kadesh seems to be the ringleader of this entire coalition that is opposing Egypt's interest. And the text goes out of its way to abuse the king of Kadesh as Egypt's primary foe. And so Kadesh almost becomes a kind of boogeyman. On the one hand, they're sort of like the Gauls for the Romans. The Kadesh then becomes sort of the bad guys. And in a second way, Kadesh almost becomes like Carthage, is that, Kadesh de Landa est, Kadesh must be destroyed, or at least must be captured, because one of the culminating events of Thutmose III's great series of military campaigns is the conquest of Kadesh. And one of his officials, I think it's a guy named Amenemheb, talks about when Thutmose III finally assaults the city of Kadesh, that this official turned soldier claims to have been the first one that pierced the ramparts of Kadesh. And then later, his son, Thutmose's son, Amenhotep II, in his Syrian campaigns, also claims to have conquered Kadesh. And so this seems to have been a place that the Egyptians had a great interest in. Now, after Amenhotep II, and even the fact that Amenhotep II had to recapture it after his father had taken it, suggests perhaps that Egypt's control of the place wasn't necessarily as secure as we might think, or the Egyptians would have us believe. And we don't really hear a lot about Kadesh after that until actually the time of Akhenaten and that going forward. And scholars like my mentor, Bill Murnane, had argued that the Egyptians had largely, quote unquote, control or hegemony over Kadesh, onward right through until the Hittites supposedly took it from them. I must admit that this is something I had thought myself. I'm becoming increasingly less sanguine about it. It may have been more independent. It's possible that the Mitanni's empire had some control over it, or it may have been just that places like Kadesh and Amurru in central Syria had a lot more breathing space to maneuver against these empires like Mitanni in Egypt that we might have otherwise have thought. But at any rate, the Egyptians seem to have been quite focused on having some control over Kadesh, I think just as much for these ideological reasons, the bad memories of Megiddo, and seeing it as a primary enemy, very much like the way I think they also viewed in the south the kingdom of Cush as a kind of boogeyman in Nubia, though perhaps not to quite the same extent. But this sort of ideology that painted Kadesh as a particularly dangerous or wretched enemy that they had to get. And so I think for both these practical reasons, but also for these ideological reasons, Kadesh had a special place in Egypt's negative emotions about foreigners.
And given its geopolitical strategic position, it might, from that perspective, it might seem strange that Kadesh itself never managed to become a great power. It always remained, at best, a mid-ranking, important kingdom. Are you willing to speculate on why this region was ever under the thumb of the foreign empires and unable to consolidate into its own major entity?
Well, again, the closest it ever was perhaps during the time of Megiddo, when it could become first among equals in order to organize this coalition. But none of these Syro-Canaanite petty states were ever able to do this. They always remained this collection of small city-states. It probably had a lot with just the environment, the natural geography. There were no great rivers, so you couldn't form a kind of river civilization like you had with Egypt, Mesopotamia. Being the crossroads of the world meant that the other empires lurking on the sides, in Mesopotamia and Egypt, always sweep down on you. And so, in many ways, they were in the wrong place. They were the fulcrum in which all these other empires could intrude. They were like the anvil in which the hammers of the great empires could smash their hammers against. And so, in many ways, their geography worked against them. They were just too tempting a target, but they didn't have the internal resources to ever develop an empire themselves, unlike some of the city-states in, say, Mesopotamia, where one city-state could get on a roll and then conquer another city-state or other city-states and at least temporarily form empires like the Babylonian Empire or the Assyrian Empire, although even they would then succumb until another empire would arise throughout the long and complex history of Mesopotamia. But I think that basically, none of these kingdoms or petty kingdoms ever had a chance. That includes Kadesh to ever really form any large. I think the kingdom of Amaru under these two kings, Diashirta and Aziru, were the closest. But even then, they only created a little petty empire that encompassed a few smaller city-states like Byblos and they were just sort of localized warlords. It's a bit more like Afghanistan than the British Empire or Imperial China.
So that brings us essentially up to, say, the reign of Seti I. There seems to be some possibility or reference from the Hittite side that following his victory at Kadesh, Seti and the Hittites had signed a treaty of some sort. What is your perspective on that as far as the evidence goes? Do you think there's enough there to suggest this actually did happen, or is it more likely an ideological statement?
Well, actually, before we get to Seti, I think there's one other pharaoh we've kind of overlooked, okay. And this is a bit of a scoop, because there's also evidence both from Hittite texts, but also it turns up in one interesting bit that we've located from Egyptian sources, Horemheb. The Hittite records, things like Muwatalli II, record an Egyptian king who campaigns in Syria, including getting involved in a rebellion of kingdom of Nukhashasheh under its king Teti against Hittite interest, and he complains about a unnamed, because they never name their enemies by name, but an unnamed Egyptian king is supposedly meddling in the business of the Hittite Empire. And a number of references are made to the Egyptian king interfering or attacking Hittite interest in Syria. There's also a famous inscription on a bowl. It's a granite bowl that my mentor Don Redford had located back in the 1970s. He'd actually seen it in an antiquity shop and copied down the inscription that refers to a campaign in year 16 of Horemheb, in which it's a gift to a general that was presumably part of this campaign, and says that Horemheb, on his first campaign of victory, actually reached the city-state of Carchemish, deep within Hittite-controlled Syria, perhaps as far as any Egyptian king had ever penetrated. But the real icing on the cake was something one of my colleagues from Chicago House had noticed years ago, and that I was able to confirm and photograph in recent years, because there is a block from a set of battle scenes that is likely to belong to a temple that Horemheb built on the west bank of Thebes that was dismantled and reused as a filling inside the pylon of the later Ramesside temple of the god Khonsu at Karnak. which is known to have been extensively built from recycled blocks from various 18th and 19th dynasty dismantled temples. And there's at least one other block that definitely shows that it's built in part from blocks that contained battle scenes of King Horemheb. Well, this particular block is built into the staircase that goes up in the pylon of the main facade of the Temple of Khonsu, and there are a number of other battle scene blocks, like ones with chariot wheels and horses' hooves. But what's so interesting about this block is it shows part of a foreign fortress that has a label inscription on the middle of the fortress that refers to the town which His Majesty destroyed in the land of Ked. But the problem is the last part of the word, the name, is missing, of course, as it always is. As soon as the text gets interesting, that's when the text is damaged. But the first two letters in the name, as it's written in hieroglyph, is K and D, and then the inscription is broken off. Well, there are two possibilities for the name. It could be the name of Kode, which is in northwest Syria on the coast. But the other possibility, and the one that's more attractive, and not just because I think it's wishful thinking, is that it actually is the name of Kadesh, which is known to have been a particular target of the Egyptians, again, at least twice before, under either Tutankhamun and Akhenaten, or maybe twice under Akhenaten, if Nipkaruri is indeed Akhenaten. Again, I think it's Akhenaten and Tutankhamun that had both attempted to take Kadesh unsuccessfully. And of course, we know later Seti I, as we'll see, and Ramesses II went after Kadesh. But this would seem yet again that Horemheb went after Kadesh, and that he, like Seti, was at least somewhat successful in it, if he is claiming to have conquered the place. Okay. And so we see that Horemheb, who is often claimed to have been sort of, quote unquote, too busy to have been able to do anything about foreign affairs, as he supposedly spent all of his time setting Egypt to right at home after the mess of the Amarna period, in fact, actually was quite active in his foreign policy. It turns out he was able to chew gum and walk at the same time, as it were, having an activist foreign policy while he was a competent administrator and builder at home, much like one of his proteges, as we'll see, Seti I.
Okay, so that brings us roughly to the end of the 14th century, approximately, and the advent of Seti I and this new ruling household in Egypt, the Ramesses. Now, we've discussed in previous interviews and on the podcast, we've discussed Seti's extensively, beautifully recorded campaigns, which are on the northern wall of the hypostyle hall at Karnak, which includes his depiction of an attack or a battle in the vicinity of Kadesh. Now, according to Seti, he was victorious over that city and reconquered it. But there does seem to be some indication from the Hittite side of things, from their record, that the Hittite ruler and Seti I may have come to some sort of agreement or treaty in the aftermath of Seti's campaigns.
Well, really, I don't think there was a treaty of this kind during this period. Now, many would argue that having achieved the crowning glory of his military conquests, that Seti now, capturing Kadesh, but also capturing Amurru, as the battle scenes also seem to imply, that he now made peace with the Hittites, and having achieved what his predecessors in the Amarna period, with the possible exception of Horemheb, of course, had been unable to achieve, finally reconquered these territories, now meekly gave them back, exchanging land for peace with the Hittites. Strikes me as rather unlikely. And in fact, neither Horemheb nor Seti I really had any incentive to make peace, especially if one or both of them had conquered Kadesh after going to all that trouble? Why would either one of them just have meekly handed it back?
Bing bong, Dominic from the future here. In the original interview, Professor Brand had an extended discussion about a supposed treaty between Horemheb, or Seti I, and the rulers of Hatti. We're going to come back to that in a future conversation with Professor Brand when we discuss diplomacy between Ramesses II and the Hittites after the Battle of Kadesh. So if you would like to learn more about these treaties and their history, we will discuss that in detail in the future. Now, back to the show. So with that in mind, do you imagine the geopolitical situation between the two at the end of Seti I's reign? Do you imagine it as sort of a Cold War has settled in, or is it an active war that Ramesses II picks up? How do you imagine it?
Well, it's tempting to use a term like Cold War, but we have to be careful about using inappropriate, anachronistic terminologies. Perhaps a better way of putting it is sort of unresolved hostilities or intermittent warfare. It's sort of like, the 100 Years' War wasn't just a continuous period of constant warfare, but a condition where hostile relations were never resolved, but there were periods of fighting, there were periods of essentially non-fighting, but not peace. And so, and of course, there's also a lot that we don't know. So there may actually have been more episodes of fighting or other campaigns that we know nothing about because the fragile records have not come down to us. But I doubt that there was constant warfare. There were probably periods when nothing much was happening militarily. But yet, as much as the ancients would have thought about it this way, a condition of war still existed. Think of a situation more like Korea today. Technically, North and South Korea, and to some extent the United States and North Korea are still technically at war. And occasionally they do exchange, artillery fire across the line of control, or there's occasionally, I think, some small naval craft gets sunk with this kind of thing. But they're not huge set-piece battles or, hundreds of missiles flying or bombing raids or this kind of thing. But they are technically at war.
So then, as I understand it, and reframing my question, when Ramesses II comes to power, there is no perception, or probably no perception among the Egyptians, that things are quiet now. There is a constant threat of a new campaign from either side or a new effort in one of these border kingdoms, and they're just simply going to respond or act as they see fit without upsetting a peace that didn't necessarily exist.
Yes, because one of the reasons I think the modern scholars have felt there was a need to come up with an explanation that involved a peace treaty by either Horemheb or Seti is how to explain why Seti or Ramesses would feel the need to go after Kadesh again. And especially why Ramesses would feel the need to go after Kadesh again after Seti had conquered it, is because the grasp of these empires on some of these territories, especially Egypt on territories in Syria that were located so far away from Egypt's homeland and which were so very close to the other great empires, that Egypt's grasp on these places was rather tenuous and weak. So one can imagine that as soon as Seti's triumphal ceremonies were over and he withdrew his armies, even if he'd set up his victory stela there, it seems unlikely that he left much or any garrison of Egyptian troops behind. Maybe he, collected some tribute or some plunder. He certainly would have extracted some oaths of loyalty from the local ruler and his elite in Kadesh. But of course, these oaths of loyalty were so much empty talk, because as soon as the dust had settled over the horizon as the Egyptian troops withdraw, the loyalty of the Kadeshis, I guess you might call them, to Egypt's pharaoh waned rapidly, especially when the delegation of Hittite ambassadors or perhaps a delegation of Hittite military commanders with armies at their back came over and basically said, "Who's your daddy?" And of course, they're going to say, "Oh, well, the king of Hatti, Muwatalli, is our boss." And they would immediately swear oaths of loyalty to him and abrogate all such oaths of loyalty to Seti I. And so, and if they didn't, they would be very sorry because they would have they'd have another battle on their hands, and they would lose this one even faster than they lost the battle against Seti I. But I doubt they were that foolish. They knew which way the wind was blowing, and they knew that it was much safer to be under the authority of the Hittites. In fact, except for this annoying pharaoh, they were quite used to having the Hittites as their overlord at this point, and knew it was a safer bet in the long run to remain as the vassals of the Hittites. Because again, let's just say that Horemheb had in fact conquered had conquered Kadesh. Well, obviously his grasp of the place didn't last very long if Seti felt obligated or the necessity of taking it once again. So how long could Seti or the people of Kadesh expect the Egyptians to have control over the place again when the Hittite Empire was just over the horizon and Egypt was far, far away? And looking even further back, noticing that in the Amarna period, the Egyptians had made a couple attempts on Kadesh and had utterly failed to take the place. So the safest bet was on the Hittite Empire, and that even if you were unlucky to have, an occasional successful Egyptian raid on the place, overall, the safest bet was in the long run, the Hittites were going to control Kadesh.
That brings us to the end of this interview with Professor Brand. My thanks to Peter for joining us once again on the show, and if you've enjoyed hearing his discussions of this history, do check out his book, Ramesses II, Egypt's Ultimate Pharaoh. It is a wonderful book that covers the reign of Ramesses II in great detail, but also in an accessible manner that anyone can pick up and learn. Ramesses II, Egypt's Ultimate Pharaoh, is available from all good retailers. Do consider picking it up. Professor Brand will be back in the future, particularly after the Battle of Kadesh, to do a after-action report or post-mortem on the battle itself. For now, it is time to say farewell. And for our narrative, it is time for the Egyptian troops to start gearing up. Ramesses will gather his army in the northeastern delta. How were they organized? How were they armed? And what can archaeology tell us about the preparation of this massive campaign? Our narrative resumes next week with the preparations for Kadesh. Thanks for listening. I'll see you soon.